Okay, I'm glad you said whatever you were going to say before, Linda. Now it's not on camera. I'm just teasing.
Exactly.
Yes. So let's start though with a volunteer who is willing to read our first set of verses here.
I can read it. On one occasion, when Jesus was going to the house of a leader of the Pharisees to eat a meal on the Sabbath, they were watching him closely. Just then, in front of him, there was a man who had dropsy. And Jesus asked the lawyers and Pharisees, "Is it lawful to cure people on the Sabbath or not?" But they were silent. So Jesus took him and healed him and sent him away. Then he said to them, "If one of you has a child or an ox that has fallen into a well, will you not immediately pull it out on a Sabbath day?" And they could not reply to this.
All right, thank you very much, Jim. This is another one of those places where if Luke really was the physician, you can kind of hear, right, the interest in a medical condition. All right, so as I said, we've been traveling along. We're midway or so, a little bit further along than that, I guess, not much though, in terms of the total number of chapters. We are in a section that we've mentioned before, which is the travel narrative. This is the biggest section in the Gospel of Luke. It is basically Jesus's journey from the Galilee region up to Jerusalem. And, kind of a circuitous path is taken. And I think major theme, of course, in this is the theme of discipleship. And so I've tried to focus on things that I think seem to be important to Luke in the way that he tells the Jesus story in that regard. What does it mean to be a disciple? And so we spent a good amount of time last week in chapter 13, and this week we're going to do chapter 14. I think, yeah, pretty much chapter 14 looks to me like. I didn't get a chance to fully review all of my notes before class started, so you guys may surprise me with questions and I'll just not know the answers.
Not me.
So well, so in this chapter, again, I'll make some comments and observations. As I mentioned here, on one occasion, so in verse 1, on one occasion when Jesus was going to the house of a leader of the Pharisees to eat a meal on the Sabbath, they were watching him closely. So what are some things that we can pull out of this? So the first thing I think is just simply to note that chapter 14 verses 1 through 24, even though this is a smaller, we begin with this, they all hang together. It goes for this sort of scene in this Pharisee's house is rather lengthy in terms of the number of verses. The second thing to note is that we encounter again the question of the Sabbath. What does the Sabbath mean? And this is usually described in the literature as a Sabbath controversy passage. It's the last major one in the Gospel of Luke. And what is at issue is not so much the keeping of the Sabbath, but to what end? What is the purpose of the Sabbath? What does it actually signify on its deepest level? And I think one of the things that we've already experienced is that there's a kind of contrast in Jesus's understanding versus the understanding of his opponents. In this case, his opponents, the religious authorities that he's over against, are the Pharisees. As I mentioned here on the first glance, though, even though this is a Sabbath controversy passage, Sabbath does not seem to be as central. But as we move through, and we start to hear, this pronounced theme of hospitality and welcome. These, I think, actually enhance our understanding of how Jesus seems to have thought about the Sabbath. So, what exactly does the Sabbath mean? Is sort of an open question that these passages kind of begin to answer. It seems to me, or to give us at least an answer for Jesus from Jesus's perspective. The second thing that we want to note, of course, is that this is not just an innocent meal, right? he's being watched closely, and he's eating at the house of a Pharisee. So this is a scene of tension, and so therefore we're not going to really be all that surprised when things turn in a certain kind of direction here shortly. All right. The first thing though that happens is we get and this is one of the things actually that's kind of interesting about the literary style of Luke. Luke often likes to present pairs. And what I mean by that are, he'll have one healing scene. Well, this one we're going to get a healing scene that's almost the same, but it's a little bit different. It's happening on the Sabbath. In this case, the earlier one, the one that we talked about actually last time, I guess it was 2 weeks ago, had to do with healing on the Sabbath, but it was the healing of a woman. In this case, it's the healing of a man. And so you'll find in Luke this idea of having pairs. So this is kind of an episode. It's a companion going back into chapter 13, verses 10 through 17. But let me just reread really quickly to remind us. So just then in front of him, there was a man who had dropsy. And Jesus asked the lawyers and Pharisees, is it lawful to cure people on the Sabbath or not? But they were silent. So Jesus took him and healed him and sent him away. Then he said to them, if one of you has a child or an ox that has fallen into a well, will you not immediately pull it out on a Sabbath day? And they could not reply to this. So a couple of comments here. And again, this is the male counterpart to the female episode that we find back in chapter 13. And I think that the chapter 13 episode is even more visceral and kind of more beautiful. We talked a little bit about that, right? That he uses this imagery of you'll unbind your animal and feed it, but you won't unbind this woman from this disease or this affliction that has kind of had her captive for many, many years. In this case, the man is described a man afflicted by dropsy. And here maybe is where Jim, you'll weigh in, given your own medical experience. Most of the commentators that I have come across describe dropsy as some sort of an edema, which I think affects the swelling in the joints. Yeah. But the idea, and maybe, I don't know, Jim, do you want to add anything else to that?
Yeah, usually it is edema in the lower extremities and can be caused by everything from kidney disease on, but usually it refers to right heart failure where the blood from the heart can't get pumped back through the heart and it backs up and you get edema. If it's the left heart, then you get congestion in the lungs, but it basically is congestive heart failure, probably on the right side.
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, so there are a couple of additional things that we would be, even though we're not necessarily, doesn't give us quite that precise of a medical diagnosis, that are important, it seems to me, to certainly to some of the commentators, and that is the idea that not only is this man going to be in pain, but that this condition is going to make it virtually impossible for him to work and therefore to support himself. And therefore, this is not only about a physical ailment that would be very painful and even life-threatening. It's about the fact that he's also a social pariah and in danger of being cast into a situation of poverty or something else. So it's a dire situation, and so this is not just any healing. It's a healing of someone who essentially doesn't have access to life. And I think what we said last time, that the meaning that we at least seem to discern in Luke chapter 13, the meaning of the Sabbath, is in some sense that it is connected to this notion that God's intention for humanity is to have access to a flourishing life. That the Sabbath is a day of pausing to remind you that you are not made simply to work, but to live, and to live in a flourishing way, right? And so you might do other kinds of activities or whatever, you would certainly worship, etc. So the true meaning of the Sabbath is in part what is at issue here. And that, of course, explains Jesus's question. Even though the other thing that I think is so fascinating about that verse 3 is that Jesus is again acting like a rabbi here. He's entering into a controversy with other rabbis, and he does so by asking a question. And this was a way that the rabbis kind of argued with one another and debated with one another, was to ask incisive questions oftentimes. So the true meaning of the Sabbath, building on chapter 13, and then I think moving us into this chapter, is that it is a kind of symbol or emblem meant to point out to us, to remind us, etc., that God's will, God's desire is not just that we would live, but that we would live lives that flourish, lives that are full, and full in a kind of, I suppose, balanced kind of way. And if that's the case, then the answer to Jesus's question, right, is it lawful to cure people on the Sabbath or not, should be pretty straightforward. If the Sabbath itself is meant to remind us that we need to have access to a flourishing life, then of course it would be lawful, because that's the actual inner meaning of what the Sabbath is. And at least that seems to me to be the proper interpretation, or the direction certainly that Jesus is thinking is going here. So yes, it is lawful that someone be set free from an affliction that is precisely keeping them from having such a life, from having access to such a life. And again, reminding ourselves that this is not just about the pain and affliction of the disease, it's also about the various social ramifications that would come with that, and particularly inability to work or to support himself. All right, let me stop for just a second and see what kinds of comments or questions or thoughts this initial passage
I just have a
provokes.
question about if the Pharisees were so appalled by some of the other teachings of Jesus, why on earth would they invite him to their house? And I know that they were watching him, but still, if someone invites you to their house, it's a message to them and to everybody else that there's some acceptance there.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think it almost sort of begs the question, like what's going on here? And I do think that this little clause at the end of verse 1 kind of gives us a clue that they're not just inviting Jesus to the house because they like him. They're inviting him because they want to trap him. They want to find something against him. And we see that, as we kind of move through. So I think that's really the primary answer to that question. That this is not an innocent invitation to come and enjoy dinner, or even to be honored at a banquet. There's something else that's going on here. Thanks, Deb.
How do you think this contrasts, this meaning of the Sabbath, being a flourishing, God really wanting us to stop work and have this flourishing life? How does that contrast with what he was teaching about the Sabbath in 13 when the woman, stopped him? Was he teaching the same thing there too?
The woman stopped him. Wait,
in chapter 13, the companion piece you said.
When he sets the woman free, you mean?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the two of these things, that they both are in some ways saying the same thing. So in that case, right, the woman, she can't stand up straight, right? And we talked about the sort of debilitating nature of that. She can't look at people straight in the face. She probably has a very hard time eking out an existence. And because of that, because of her status as someone who is afflicted by this, I suppose we could conjecture, could she have had children? We don't know how old she is, etc. But just that image of being bound is really important to the argument that's developed, because he sets her free. He doesn't use the language of unbinding when he talks about her, but he does explicitly use the language of unbinding when he talks about what the leaders of the synagogue would do for their animals, right? And if you remember, there's a man, the head of the synagogue, gets really angry that Jesus does this, and Jesus is like, what are you talking about? Like, you will take your animal out and feed them and like give them access to what it. Yeah, so I in a sense, just a slightly different setting.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Other comments or questions?
Not often that you have lawyers that remain silent. I thought that was interesting.
That's right. That's right. You got to pass that on to Chuck. Okay. All right. Well, so continuing the scene, can I get a volunteer who's willing to read the next section?
I'll read it. So when he noticed how the guests chose the places of honor, he told them a parable. When you are invited by someone to a wedding banquet, do not sit down at the place of honor in case someone more distinguished than you has been invited by your host. And the host who invited both of you may come and say to you, give this person your place. And then in disgrace, you would start to take the lowest place. But when you are invited, go and sit down at the lowest place so that when your host comes, he may say to you, friend, move up higher. And then you will be honored in the presence of all who sit at the table with you. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. He said also to the one who had invited him, when you give a luncheon or dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors in case they may invite you in return and you would be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous.
Awesome. Okay. So you can kind of, this is an interesting passage because there's a kind of intensification, or maybe there's a better word, but there's sort of a movement from sort of what feels like common sense advice to like completely uncommon sense advice. And in a sense, it's very interesting because it's almost like, Jesus connects to the everyday experience that people would think about, and then he pushes beyond even that boundary to show you the way in which the kingdom of God is radically unique. All right, so what can we say here? So first of all, this section is unique to Luke, this little scene here. And in chapter 7, or excuse me, not chapter 7, but verses 7 through 11, he is especially speaking to the guests in the room. Whereas in verse 12, he turns and he starts to address the person who seems to have invited him. So just keeping all that kind of in mind in terms of the structure of who it is that Jesus is talking to. So let's start then here with verse 7. So he says, when he noticed how the guests chose the places of honor, he told them a parable. Now, I think the best way to make sense of that, this little brief sentence here, is that what's happening, what Jesus is observing, is actually common practice in the ancient world at this time. So they're not doing anything that's really out of the ordinary or necessarily unusual, even if Jesus is going to sort of in some sense say it might be problematic, especially depending on how you live into it, I suppose. In the ancient world, that world was highly stratified. And what I mean by that was that you had honor and shame, you had patron and you had client, and you had these relationships of over and under that could go from the lowest all the way up to the highest, and multiple gradations in between. And of course, the aim in the ancient world in the honor shame binary was to increase your honor as much as possible and to decrease your shame as much as possible. You did so, particularly honor was something that you accrued to yourself in the public realm. And so a banquet is a very good setting for accruing honor. And there were certain seats. And those seats were actually closer to the food than the other seats, and that was what signified that you were. It was the honorable seat, so it was like the place, to, prized place to sit. So people are kind of vying for. Essentially, that's kind of the picture. They're vying for the seat of honor, essentially. So Jesus then, as I say here, gives what I think is kind of common sense advice to these people. As they're trying to kind of work the system, basically. And that starts in verse 8 when he says, when you are invited by someone to a wedding banquet, do not sit down at the place of honor in case someone more distinguished than you has been invited for your host. And the host who invited both of you may come and say to you, give this person your place. And then in disgrace, you would start to take the lowest place. But when you are invited, go and sit down at the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he may say to you, friend, move up higher. Then you will be honored in the presence of all who sit at the table with you. So you can kind of hear, even in those verses, the honor shame element, right? Don't go and try to grab the best place only to have it taken away, because the thing that you really want, which is to be honored, you could wind up actually receiving dishonor. You could actually be shamed, right? And that's essentially what he says, right? If you wind up having to take the lowest place, it's a disgrace. So this would be, and as I say here, I think this would be kind of sage advice, even for a social climber. So, so someone who's like gonna, play the game, or like knows how to work the system or whatever. They would find this, I think, good advice, very clever advice. And in fact, the idea is to carefully think about your actions and whether it's wise to risk doing something that will potentially bring you dishonor, right? So in a sense, like Jesus is like offering what sounds like sage advice, but in a way we're going to understand in a minute that the real theme is humility. That humility is the real thing, as opposed to like necessarily increasing your honor or decreasing your dishonor. And verse 11, in some sense, begins to bring us into that. In verse 11, we get kind of a repeat of something that we already heard back in chapter 13. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Now, this kind of talk is going to become, it's already something that we've encountered, right? But it is going to now start in this moment to really ramp up in a variety of iterations. And what I mean by that is that humility and becoming like a child, understanding that the kingdom of God does not belong, quote unquote, to insiders, but rather to outsiders, not to the powerful, but rather to the weak, not for the people who expect it or think, kind of demand it, but rather to those who receive it as a gift. That kind of contrast is going to basically be at play here. So it makes sense, in a sense, that we encounter this here, and it's again a restatement of something that we've already heard back in chapter 13, verse 30. The other thing, though, that's interesting about it, of course, is that we have sage advice being given to us in verses 8 through 10. Well, this verse starts to tell us that Jesus is not just, a lounge lizard, giving you sage advice. Like, that's not what really motivates him. That there's actually something else at play. And that something else at play, as I say here, is that the kingdom that Jesus is going to be talking about, that he really embodies in a sense, oftentimes overthrows the expected social norms that we see, that we sort of expect or whatever, or that we have created. So, and as I say here, we can also go back into those earlier parables in chapter 13 can you hold on for just a second? Can you guys? Okay, sorry about that. All right. All right, well, let me shift this then into the second, because once you shift into the second paragraph, the radicalism of Jesus's vision of the kingdom begins to come through a little bit more explicitly. And so I'm just going to read this, and then I'll offer a couple of thoughts on this. He said also to the one who had invited him, when you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors, in case they may invite you in return, and you would be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed, because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. Excuse me. All right. So it's pretty straightforward that we've left lounge lizard Jesus behind, and we've gotten back to radical Jesus, right? Right, because this advice, as I say here, this is advice that literally would make no sense in the context of the ancient world, right? You held banquets, at least most kind of people, certainly people who were social climbers, held banquets precisely to increase their honor. And how did you do that? You invited other people of great honor, right? And they embellished you, and there was a kind of, quid pro quo kind of a thing going on. Well, that's not happening here, right? And there's a pretty clear contrast. And in some ways, Jesus is actually undermining the idea that this Pharisee even invited Jesus himself, right? I mean, another reason I think that we might add, Deb, for why Jesus gets invited to the Pharisee's house is because Jesus is a person of renown at this point. Bringing him to your house might increase your honor, et cetera, along with, of course, the more nefarious parts. So there's a contrast between friends, brethren, relatives, wealthy neighbors, all the people, in other words, who are equipped to give you honor, with this other little quadruplet: the poor, the crippled, lame, and blind. And these four are going to replay themselves multiple times as we move through this section of Luke. So starting in chapter 14, I think it takes us almost all the way up into chapter 18. You hear it again and again and again. And what you hear is that these are the ones to whom the kingdom of God belongs. And of course, that is a slap in the face to a certain extent of those who operate with a different kind of logic. The other thing to note here is that this is not just about extending hospitality to strangers. And what I mean by that is that the poor, crippled, lame, and blind, potentially, number one, might have been considered unclean. So they might have been rich, they might have been considered unpure, right? So it goes beyond even Middle Eastern hospitality to strangers, or cultural hospitality to travelers, because we're talking here especially about the folks who, and if we really got into it, the folks who some of the rabbis thought were accursed, right? They were too poor, and because they were too poor, they were uneducated, and because they were uneducated, they were unable to keep Torah, and so they oftentimes called the people of the land were sometimes considered accursed. So you're saying you want us to invite them in? That those are the ones to whom the kingdom of God belongs? I mean, that's kind of that would be sort of the kind of retort, in a sense. And I have slightly changed this in sort of a little bit of updated language, that what Jesus is saying is that there's a call here to extend hospitality to the godless, or those who are viewed as godless, the irreligious, and the damned, right? And of course, it goes without saying, Jesus, of course, is talking here to his host, but it goes without saying that not only would his host, but all of his guests would have heard this and felt, obviously deeply uncomfortable. Why do you do this? In a sense, you do this because, and I think here's sort of the implication in the background, and here also is where the other gospels are helpful interlocutors. But Matthew chapter 25, right, basically makes it clear that to care for these folk, to care for the poor, crippled, lame, and blind, is in effect to care for God, right? This is Jesus visiting you, etc. This is God visiting you. And so and of course, this last comment here, the issue of repayment really has to do, in a sense, with the upending of normal social etiquette. So there's a kind of belief of repayment. I don't think it's like, hey, if you invite these people in, it's going to be added onto the ledger, that you're going to be repaid as. It's really more of a rhetorical comment in terms of this is really what you get. So from the perspective then of this episode, a true welcome is a welcome that goes beyond the normal boundaries of acceptability, and more than likely, and I don't have it included here, but more than likely, it's going to mean that we become uncomfortable, right? I mean, to be a good host in the sense that Jesus is kind of advocating here is going to require that we put ourselves in a situation that might make us uncomfortable, that probably will make us uncomfortable, So let me stop there for a second and see what kind of comments or questions or thoughts.
But it does parallel what God has done for us.
Yeah, that's right. Say more.
Yeah, that he has, here, God of the universe has literally, exceeded, gone beyond the boundaries of acceptability and welcoming us into his kingdom.
That's right.
So, yeah.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, there's nothing in this that we don't see in some sense being lived out in front of us, right?
And it's that theme that you brought up in an earlier chapter, I think it was in 6, about really this whole theme of being merciful, just as our Father is merciful.
That's right. And if you think about the extent of that and how hard that is, and how, in a sense, how much of a life's work it is, I think that helps to put it into perspective. It's something to work at, and yet it is a constant calling. And churches face this all the time. It's not just individuals, of course, right? Trying to make ourselves open, inviting, welcoming, etc. And it's interesting because invariably people get upset about it, or there are things that clash. You have culture clashes. I remember when we were at EPPC, the Prairie Presbyterian Church, before they changed the name, we shared the building with a Pentecostal church, and it was mostly Latino immigrants, Spanish speaking. And I think for some members in the congregation, not everybody, but for some members in the congregation, they could never get comfortable with that idea. And it would come out sideways, like, oh, they leave the children's room a mess, or, and why are we renting the building to them when they can't take care of stuff and stuff like that? So there are different kinds of ways that can play itself out.
I like what you said before about Jesus is really, I forgot the phrase you used, something about turning it on its head.
Yeah, the upside down kingdom.
The upside, yeah. Because the Pharisees thought very well of themselves, and the people thought they were closer to God because they knew Torah. But now Jesus is saying, no, it's for everyone. And but in a lot of ways, I like that we do that to each other. We categorize each other based on education or wealth or whatever it is we categorize. But then when you bring God into it or Jesus into it, and then we're compared to, well, God, it just, it's ridiculous. So I like that you brought that up.
Thank you. Thanks, Deb. Those are great thoughts. Other comments from folks?
Isn't there a prophecy in the Old Testament too that the Messiah had to come within a certain amount of time, like this, I think it's 25-year period of time. So they were all waiting for him. But in the Old Testament, they said that you'll know, one of the ways that you'll know it's the Messiah was that everyone will be able to see God and be welcomed into the kingdom of God. And Jesus is doing just that. He's welcoming everybody.
I'm not entirely sure which one you're talking about, but there certainly are some passages that give sort of a light to the Gentiles and
Right.
that kind of thing, if that's what you're talking about. Yeah. Yeah. All right, let's move us forward. We're still in the same scene. And if I could have anyone or someone, excuse me, to read our last set of verses here for this particular scene, that'd be great. Well, it's
David,
either
read it.
it's Richard, David, or Deb.
Go for it, David.
I'll
Go
start,
for
and
it.
if I choke up, someone can take over for me.
Okay.
One of the dinner guests, on hearing this, said to him, "Blessed is anyone who will eat bread in the kingdom of God." And Jesus said to him, "Someone gave a great dinner and invited many. At the time for the dinner, he sent his slave to say to those who had been invited, 'Come, for everything is ready now.' But they all alike began to make excuses. The first said to him, 'I have bought a piece of land and I must go out and see, and I can't see what that is. Please accept my regrets.' Another said, 'I have bought 5 yoke of oxen and I'm going to try them out. Please accept my regrets.' Another said, 'I have just been married and therefore I cannot come.' So the slave returned and reported this to his master. Then the owner of the house became angry and said to his slave, 'Go out at once into the streets and the lanes of the town and bring in the poor, crippled, the blind, and the lame.' And the slave said, 'Sir, what you have ordered has been done. Is there still room?' Then the master said to the slave, 'Go out into the roads and lanes and compel people to come in so that my house may be filled. For I tell you, none of those who were invited will taste my dinner.'"
Awesome. You didn't choke up at all.
No,
kidding You kidding me? Come on.
Thanks, Rick.
Thanks, Rick.
but
All right. So this is the banquet scene. One of those scenes that this is kind of what inspired my opening question. And it's one of, multiple different scenes. And actually Luke in particular, there's one commentator who noted that it seems like Jesus eats his way through the Gospel of Luke. Like there's so many scenes with food and so many scenes at table that he ends his life sitting at the table, the very end of the resurrection, the Emmaus Road, etc. He's eating. Anyway, so we have this banquet scene here. And first thing though is that we have this in verse 15, this kind of interjection. So one of the dinner guests on hearing this said to him, "Blessed is anyone who will eat bread in the kingdom of God." It's interesting. It's an interjection, but I think it'd be fair to say that given what follows, it might just be like an abrupt, it's hard to know, to make sense of exactly what this is if it's nothing more than just someone sort of trying to be on the right side of things. Because Jesus's response certainly seems to make this feel like it's a tepid interjection at best. It's possible that it's more than that, but I'm not convinced if that's the case. So then we turn and we get this parable from Jesus. And so starting in verse 16, and I've broken this down into 2 or 3 pieces here. So verses 16 through 20 is the first. So then Jesus said to him, someone gave a great dinner and invited many. At the time for the dinner, he sent his slave to say to those who had been invited, come, for everything is ready now. But they all alike began to make excuses. The first said to him, I have bought a piece of land and I must go out and see it. Please accept my regrets. Another said, I've bought 5 yoke of oxen and I'm going to try them out. Please accept my regrets. Another said, I've just been married and therefore I cannot come. All right, so what do we do with these? The first is we have 3 different invitees, and each of them offers 3 different responses. I think it'd be fair to say we can clump the first 2 together, and then the third one is kind of a little bit unique, but they kind of signify, in other words, something. And I think sort of that's kind of the point of why these particular examples are given. So the first 2, right, I've bought a piece of land and I've bought 5 yoke of oxen. These are basically the troubles of the wealthy, right? To be able to purchase land was not something that, the average, certainly not the poor person, the person that we're going to hear about in just a minute, that the rest of the parable makes clear, and certainly not 5 yoke of oxen, right? So these, in other words, would be the people that if someone was holding a banquet, they would want them to come, right? So he's, because he's kind of setting up in a sense. So they refuse to come because they're just too busy attending to their wealth, essentially. The third one, and as I say here, they're busy attending to affairs that may or may not have to do with justice. And how did they have the money that they had to buy 5 yoke of oxen? A huge issue during this time period is what is it? Absentee landlords is a major issue. People are buying up land and not really actually coming to be there or to attend to it, et cetera. So that could be a background, maybe not, who knows. But nevertheless, they're too busy doing things that really have to do essentially with what we might call wealth. The third example is someone who is more distracted by the mundane concerns of life, right? And of course, this also is going to be called into question as we move into, and certainly as we move into the next section, if we're able to get to, I think we'll be able to get to that tonight. It is, as I say, it is the most definitive in some sense in regard to the response. But I think it's so we have the distractions of wealth and the distractions of everyday life that keep people from coming, and they are in some sense the people that you might want to come if you were hosting a banquet in the ancient world. Well, what happens? The host obviously becomes upset. So in verse 21, so the slave returned and reported this to his master. Then the owner of the house became angry and said to his slave, go out at once into the streets and lanes of the town and bring in the 4 that we just heard, right? The poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame. So those 4 that we've just heard about, we hear about again, we're going to hear about again down the road, et cetera, et cetera. So the host is upset. And one of the reasons why he's upset is that for them to turn down an invitation would be, in fact, to dishonor the host. So number 1, these are actions that dishonor the host. Of course, he's upset. Then the host, strangely, right? So in some ways, the first part of the parable sort of feels like normal everyday life, even though it's kind of scandalous. The second part is, again, Jesus like turning things upside down, Deb, because now he says, what? Go out to the quote unquote unworthy and invite them in, right? So the same group that we've just heard about back in verse 13, the ones that we renamed the godless, the irreligious, and the damned, they are now invited in to take the place and to take the places of quote unquote the more acceptable. Now, the implication, of course, of this is at play here, and I'll kind of try to pull some of that out as we move through. So then turning to 22 through 24, the kind of the denouement, or the end of the parable. And the slave said, "Sir, what you ordered has been done, and there is still room." Then the master said to the slave, "Go out into the roads and lanes and compel people to come in, so that my house may be filled. For I tell you, none of those who were invited will taste my dinner." And you can kind of hear here an insider outsider, right? Kind of dynamic at play. So this banquet hall is large enough not only to welcome in the quote unquote unworthy, the poor, but even those who are not necessarily citizens of the city. And I think this is important, and I think it'd be fair to say that that is probably a kind of veiled reference to Gentiles, right? You're inviting in people, and in a sense, you're inviting in and compelling people to come who would think that they have no right whatsoever to come, right? And I think this is why you get the language of compel them. So as I say here in the outline, whatever one decides, if it's Gentiles or not, this is a group that's outside the city, and that in a sense would not believe that it is worthy, or even that they fit. They don't necessarily belong. So of course they have to be compelled to come in. And the message here is that those who don't think they belong actually do, right? Because everyone belongs in a sense. But those who assume that they belong, and they use that as a cudgel to push other people out, they may in fact not belong. And that's kind of the message that seems to kind of move through the whole thing. So the point, it seems to me, it comes back to something that we've heard before, and that will be reiterated several times in this section of the Gospel of Luke, that those who believe that they deserve and belong in God's kingdom may find themselves on the outside. So insider, outsider, the very set of categories of that are in some ways being called into question, because what God is interested in is healing those who are in genuine need, those who are in need. And of course, in provoking us all, I think, to realize that we have this great need, etc., along with a few other things. So let me stop there for a second and see what kind of comments or questions you all may have.
Yeah, Christian, I wondered, now, what we talk about the poor, crippled, lame, and blind, but then also you mentioned the godless, irreligious, and the damned, but they wouldn't necessarily have to, I mean, they could be God-fearing crippled people, God-fearing blind people, that sort of thing. So we can't really equate the two, but are you saying it with reference to this passage that he's speaking to the Jewish leaders that, okay, you had your chance and you blew it, so now we're going to open it up to other Jewish people who are not in the big time, or the Gentiles? Is that more what you're saying? It's
I'm
the
saying,
underlying
well, I was
meaning?
saying both. Yeah, I'm saying both. I'm saying, yes, of course, the poor, lame, crippled, blind could be people of faith, obviously. But from the perspective of the religious elite, they would not have viewed them in that way. They would have viewed them precisely as the accursed, right? If you're too poor, and this was an assumption that you hear in some of the prayers actually said in certain circles, thank God you didn't make me poor. Thank God you didn't make me a woman, right? Because all those statuses were viewed as being somehow damned or godless, or outside the pale. And so Jesus, in a sense, is calling all that into question. So that's kind of how I'm using that language there. They may or may not have been, that. But I think for us, as we think about it, we do want to think about the people who would appear to us to be godless, right? Right, that they also might have a place and be brought in, etc.
But I think it's important that we see ourselves that way too, as undeserving of what God offers.
That's right.
We won't want to hang out with these quote unquote undesirables unless we see ourselves compared to God as undesirables as well. I mean,
what he uses, I think, and I would agree. I want us to be careful not to slip into the like, I hate myself kind of religion. But he does use the image that he uses in Luke, which I think is really helpful for getting at your point, Deb, is that you have to become like a little baby.
Right.
You know, and a little baby has no claim. Little baby has no claim on anybody, except that they're just a little baby, right? That's it. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, only the sick need a doctor. I mean, we have to see ourselves in need of God, whatever that means to you. I mean, that has to be our posture.
Right. That's right. All right, this is great. I'll move us into our last passage. Let's see here. All right, so if I can have a volunteer for this.
I can do this. Now large crowds were traveling with him, and he turned and said to them, "Whoever comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, and even life itself, cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not carry the cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. For which of you, intending to build a tower, does not first sit down and estimate the cost to see whether he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he has laid a foundation and is not able to finish, all who see it will begin to ridicule him, saying, 'This fellow began to build and was not able to finish.' Or what king, going out to wage war against another king, will not sit down first and consider whether he is able with 10,000 to oppose the one who comes against him with 20,000? If he cannot, then while the other is still far away, he sends a delegation and asks for the terms of peace. So therefore, none of you can become my disciple if you do not give up all your possessions. Salt is good, but if salt has lost its taste, how can its saltiness be restored? It is fit neither for the soil nor for the manure pile. Then throw it away. Let anyone with ears to hear listen."
All right. Thank you very much. And let anyone with ears to hear listen. All right. And I'll come back to that last little quip as we kind of end this this section here. The first thing to note is that we certainly, as I say here, have an abrupt change of scenery, right? All of a sudden, we're no longer in the Pharisee's house. We're now either outside the house or we're back on our journey. And this is one of those places where Luke doesn't always give us a precise kind of geographical description of exactly what's going on. Jesus now, though, in a sense, he turns now to address the crowds. And this, I don't really have something here on the outline, but it does strike me as I think about it now that, the way that the religious elite view the crowds is that they view them in a despicable way. They don't care for them. They despise the people for the most part. And in a sense, you could read this as Jesus sort of turning to the crowd and saying, just because you're a member of the crowd, doesn't mean it's not going to cost you something as well to follow after the kingdom. That could be, I think, an important element to keep here, or to keep in mind here. And there are, even though there's this abrupt change, there are some connecting points to the preceding chapter, and I'll try to bring those out as I'm able as we move through. All right, so starting in 25 and up through 27. Now large crowds were traveling with him, and he turned and said to them, "Whoever comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, and even life itself, cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not carry the cross and follow me cannot be my disciple." All right, there's a couple of things here we want to tease out. Number one, hatred here is not so much about emotions as it is about action. And you have to, it would be basically getting into, I think, sort of the Greek grammar, the way that this particular word is used. The question here really is, where is your allegiance? Is your allegiance to the kingdom? Is your allegiance to following after Jesus? Or is your allegiance, and don't necessarily throw in father, mother, wife, children. Rather, it's the normal expectations that are put upon you, right? Because remember, there was one guy who didn't go to the banquet. Why? Because he just got married. You know, there's an earlier scene, I can't remember if we did it together, where Jesus is trying to call people to be disciples, and you know, one guy's like, I got to go bury my father, I got to go do this, I got to go do that, and Jesus is like, no, you know, you have to, you know, it's not those expectations. You really need to have that following as sort of the center of your life. That's what it's going to cost, essentially. Number 27, verse 27, though, intensifies this in a way that I think is interesting, especially given that it kind of stands out if you think about it. You and I, we kind of know the story of Jesus. We know to a certain extent how this ends, and we know that it ends with Jesus on a cross. But Jesus has not yet predicted that he will be hung on a cross. He's just predicted that he's going to be, and he has 3 different passion predictions, and they certainly have to do with, you know, being executed, handed over, killed, etc. But cross language and imagery doesn't necessarily come up. So what am I saying? I'm saying that there could be some aspect of the life of the early church that's being read into this, right? Because Luke is writing this in the 80s, so a couple of generations after the events of Jesus. But I think what's even more kind of interesting is that the cross imagery expands this from the circle of family relations to social relations. And the reason why is because a cross was a political instrument of torture. It was, so to take up a cross was to become, so Jesus is saying you not only have to quote unquote become enemies of your intimate relations, you have to also quote unquote risk becoming an enemy of the state and the social order itself, which I think is actually a pretty powerful and profound sort of choice to be presented with. So the cross, again, as I say here, is a political instrument of torture, and in a sense, this widens out the circle. It's not just family; it's the social and political order itself. In other words, this upside down kingdom that Jesus is going to ask you to embrace it could come with costs, right? And you need to know that, and you need to make informed choices. And so that's why then we get these 3 parables following it. So let's start with our first parable. I want to make sure I break these into the proper. So for which of you intending to build a tower does not first sit down and estimate the cost to see whether he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he has laid a foundation and is not able to finish, all who see it will begin to ridicule him, saying, this fellow began to build and was not able to finish. So the first parable draws on an agricultural practice. You built towers in your fields, in a sense, to be able, it's kind of like being able to see if there were predators around. So that's the kind of tower, that's at least the language in Greek is used to refer to that. And the meaning here is pretty straightforward. If you start building a tower and you can't complete it, basically it's going to look shabby, and it's going to be actually something that is dishonorable in a sense, right? So you don't want to be a laughing stock in the community. So you want to know what you're being called into, right? And you want to count the cost, etc. Then we get a second parable. Again, the meaning is relatively straightforward, but here it comes out of the political realm. starting in verse 31. Or what king going out to wage war against another king will not sit down first and consider whether he is able with 10,000 to oppose the one who comes against him with 20,000? If he cannot, then while the other is still far away, he sends a delegation and asks for the terms of peace. So therefore, none of you can become my disciple if you do not give up all your possessions. I'll come back actually to that verse 33 there. So I want to hold on to that for just a second. So the second parable, though, right, the parable with the king, again, straightforward meaning. No good king who cares for his people is going to go to war with another king who is going to easily destroy and smash his people. Otherwise, he's a terrible kingdom, right? It's the same kind of basic idea. It would be calamitous and stupid, as I say here on the outline. All right. Then we get this very curious passage, which is the one that typically people stumble on, right? Which is verse 33. To give away all your possessions. So what is Jesus talking about here? So therefore, none of you can become my disciple if you not give up all your possessions. And my argument, in a sense, is that in this place and in a couple of other places, what Jesus is talking about when he uses the language of possessions and giving them up is that you have to be willing to set aside all the relationships, all of the things that give you security and shape your life. That's really the question. In other words, let's kind of reframe what we heard at the beginning about hating your mother, father, et cetera, et cetera. The question is, does your genetic lineage, does that determine ultimately your allegiances, or does Jesus, right, and following after Jesus determine your loyalties? That's kind of the question, in a sense. So the giving up, I would argue the giving up here means a willingness to part with those things that provide security. That essentially discipleship, it calls us into a new form of life. And again, this makes sense, right? We've seen a banquet, right? And we've heard advice that would make very little sense to some people in a particular context, et cetera. So this is kind of carrying that further and intensifying it in order to highlight that one does have to, in fact, make a choice in this regard. We then get the last parable, the third parable, which starts in verse 34. Salt is good, but if salt has lost its taste, how can its saltiness be restored? It is fit neither for the soil nor for the manure pile. They throw it away. All right, so that's this last kind of image, this last sort of parable. And basically this intensifies the first two parables because basically it's saying you have to make a choice, right? The first two, in a sense, as I say here, the first two spoke about failing to really commit yourself to discipleship as possible sources of ridicule and foolishness. Here, the tone is a bit more ominous, right? If you don't retain your saltiness, if you don't, be what you're supposed to be, you get this image of being thrown into the fire. Now, I don't want to go down. Remember, this is a parable, therefore it's allegory, therefore it ought not to be read overly literally. But there is a much more ominous tone to it, right? It's intensified because the first one is about being, made a laughingstock. The second one is calamitous for your people. This one it feels even more so. All right, what can we say? Right, with the image of a salt losing its saltiness, you get this sense of over time, right? That there's a kind of implied message here that over time we need to renew our commitment, right? So that we don't lose our potency as people who are seeking to follow after Jesus. It's not just a one-time thing. It's that you have to attend to this, right? And again, if we do lose our potency, we can actually become sources of danger. And this is one of the reasons why you don't throw the salt in the manure pile, because what do you do with manure? You spread it on the field. And if you put salt in that, it's going to destroy your field. So you have to throw it away. Otherwise, it's dangerous. It makes it impossible for crops to grow. What do we get at the end? Let anyone with ears to hear listen. And this is, I would say, I would describe this as like yes, these are hard sayings. And so you need to sit with them for a while. And I think this is one of the reasons why Jesus oftentimes also taught parables, was to make us slow down and to have to think and rethink and rethink and re-listen, even as we continue to live our lives, to try to live out our faithfulness. We have to revisit what we hear from Jesus. So, as I say here, the saying reminds the hearer to revisit again and again and again. All right.
You finished everything this
I
time.
did. We went.
Yeah.
I can't believe it. In fact, I
great.
saw it and I was like, wow, this is going really fast.
Yeah.
Maybe this is because the other people who aren't here tonight, slow us down.
That's right. They just get going. They're just a bunch of
So many
windbags.
questions. They have so many questions.
Well, I love the questions. To me, that's where the good stuff
Yeah,
happens. So.
exactly.
Now, Christian, I hate to do this. I really do. Believe me.
Uh-oh.
I hate
Uh-oh.
but I got to do it.
Okay.
I kind of disagree with you on this last part. I agree that parables are meant to cause us to, think and rethink. But, I'm an example of that last parable, that you have to give up everything that's comfortable to you to follow Jesus. So I'm not sure. I mean, I know that parables aren't prophecy. They don't necessarily happen, but we are called to a new life,
Right.
and, if you're Jewish or Muslim or Buddhist or whatever, you are going to be asked to enter into something new.
Mhm.
Now, that's not the end of the story. God also loves restoring relationships. So even if it does cost you a great deal, and it did me, God can restore those relationships. Maybe not all of them, but he will at least work pretty hard at it. So I kind of have to disagree with some of what you said a little bit. I'm sorry. I really am. I really like you so much.
Yeah, Deb, I don't think you're disagreeing with me. I think you just misheard me, because I didn't say any of what you're sort of thinking that I said.
All right.
I simply was saying that in regard to the image of being thrown into the fire, that is that because this is a parable, we need to be careful about over literal readings of that.
Right.
I did not say at all anything that I hope would take away from the idea that we're being called to make a choice, that discipleship does mean, in fact, turning away, and that possessions here really does. I mean, in a sense, like you're a great example of precisely what this word, I think, is meaning here.
Right.
It's not just a kind of command or request to give up all your money.
Right.
It's the things that make your life, give shape to your life.
Right.
Because the question is, what gives shape to your life?
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Everything about being Jewish gave shape to my life. I loved everything about it. I still do.
Yeah. And I think this is also, to me, this is one of those places where the church, people who are teaching, we want to be, I think you have to be, this is one of those places where we want to be careful with these passages.
Right.
Because, for instance, there are other examples where people do give up their connections to their family, and and that winds up actually being profoundly unhealthy, right? And because it has like a kind of brainwashing element. So these passages have been used for really nefarious things,
Right.
So I want to make sure we're careful of that. But I think the basic argument is, and it fits really well with that the banquet imagery,
Right.
that that Jesus is imagining an entirely different way of being,
Right.
and that you have to basically choose. You can't do kind of both.
Right.
You have to
But
choose.
I also think when he just uses that imagery of a banquet in the kingdom of heaven and da 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 da, not to be disrespectful, he's contrasting and giving us something greater. Something greater is here, something greater than the life you've ever lived. And I mean, is that true? You know, but that's all I wanted to say. Good. I'm glad I didn't disagree.
We're not in disagreement, Deb.
Well, that day
I
might
wish-
still come.